Hello everybody. So we continue on the lecture about mortality, and the specific topic now that I'm going to cover is related to short history of mortality in the world. So let's just go to slide 73 and talk about like this specific portion of the chapter related to mortality. So this portion here about the short history of mortality in the world, I'm going to cover topics related to these points here. So define the health and mortality transition, and then talk about health and mortality changes over time, the differences between lifespan and longevity, and then talk about disease and death over the life cycle, causes of poor health and death, and also some health and mortality inequalities. So first of all, it's important for us to know the difference between morbidity and mortality, because these are pretty much two sides of the same topic that we are dealing here. So health and death. So these are two sides of morbidity and mortality. Morbidity is related to the prevalence of disease in the population. So morbidity is related to diseases, is related to health. And mortality is the pattern of death. So whenever we are talking about this general topic of mortality, actually we are not just only dealing with death, but we also have to think about morbidity, the prevalence of diseases, which diseases are most prevalent in a specific society. So the health and mortality transition, the knowledge that we start to have about it historically started being implemented or discussed by Omran back in the 70s, when he suggested he talked about changes in mortality and morbidity patterns in the world, and he called it an epidemiological transition. So what exactly was the epidemiological transition? Which changes happened at that time? The epidemiological transition is the shift, is the change from prevailing poor health or high morbidity and high death rates, high mortality, primarily from communicable diseases occurring especially among the young people, into a pattern of prevailing good health and low death rates from infectious diseases, with most people dying at older ages from degenerative diseases. So we move from a pattern of really high morbidity, high mortality. Most of the causes of death were related to communicable diseases, and the rates of mortality were really high among young people. And then nowadays we have a better health pattern in the societies and low death rates related to infectious diseases, and most people now are dying to degenerative diseases, and most of the people tend to be at older ages. So for virtually all of human history, early death was commonplace. But beginning about 200 years ago, we have been steadily pushing death to older ages. So the improvements in health and mortality, they happened just in the last couple of centuries in our history. The survival of more people to even older ages, is a key contribution to demographic transition. So the demographic transition, that change that I mentioned before, that it's conceptualized in the epidemiological transition, it's pretty much caused by more people surviving to older ages. Most people now they survive to advanced ages and die pretty quickly when they reach these more advanced ages. And the variability by age in mortality is compressed nowadays, leading to an increase in what is called the rectangularization of mortality. So most people survive to advanced ages and then at these advanced ages they die, and this process kind of makes the rates of mortality to be more compressed. The variability by age is more compressed, leading to this pattern of rectangularization of mortality. How do we see this process in a graph format, for example? So here we have data about the percentage of people alive in each one of these age groups for the US. And this first line here is for data from 1901 to 1910, and then from 1951 to 1960, and for 2011. So these are the percentage of people alive for each one of these age groups. So for whenever people are born, we have 100% of people who are alive, and then people start to die, and the percentage of those alive start to drop until we reach 0% in older ages. And here we have the life expectancy 52 years of age back in 1901, 1910, 72, and then 81. And in this exercise here that we see in the last curve is just a theoretical exercise that we make. Like, let's say that nobody dies in all these age groups here. So 100% of the people stay alive, and they stay alive up to age 100. So that's just a theoretical exercise just for us to understand this rectangularization of mortality. So let's say that everybody stay alive up to age 100, and then afterwards they die. So the life expectancy at birth in this case would be 108 years of age. So in this case, what we see is that in more recent years, in this case here 2011, these rates, this percentage of people alive by age groups, they are getting closer into this theoretical example here of people being alive up to age 100 and then everybody dying afterwards. So that's exactly what is happening of people wish to die more in younger ages. So the percentage still alive in these younger ages were dropping a lot. But as we have improvements in health and mortality, these people tend to live longer, and then the curves start to have this more rectangular shape, which would approach this one here based on this theoretical example. So for most of history, life expectancy fluctuated between 20 and 30 years of age. So people lived on average really just between 20 and 30 years. Life expectancy was really low. About 2/3 of babies survived to their first birthday, and about half were still alive at age 5. So mortality was really, really high in the first years of life. Now, 99% of the babies, they're still alive at age 5, or the children are alive at age 5. Around 10% of the people made it to age 65 in a pre-modern society. Now, 90% of the people, they reach age 65. So mortality dropped a lot, and life expectancy improved a lot over these last decades, these last centuries. But still, we see variation in life expectancy at birth across countries. And this is an example from 2015 of female life expectancy at birth. And in North America and Western Europe, Australia, and some countries in South America, we have a high female life expectancy at birth. And in sub-Saharan African countries, you have a lot of still high mortality, and then you have lower levels of female life expectancy at birth. So you still have a lot of variation across countries, even in more recent years. But we have seen health improvements overall. These are the life expectancy only among women in pre-modern societies. It used to be around 20, 30 years of age for women, as we mentioned in previous slides. And for the US and Europe in the late 18th and early 19th century, life expectancy increased to 40 years of age. And then in more recent years, the variation that we see across like across countries, it's still really high. The range is really high. The life expectancy among women has the lowest levels in sub-Saharan Africa, 46 years of age on average. The world average in around 2015 was 73, Mexico 78, United States 81, Canada 84, and Japan, which has the highest life expectancy at birth, 86. So nowadays you see a lot of variation from 46 to 86 in these examples here. And here you have the percentage of surviving people into age 1, 5, 25, and 65. So in pre-modern societies, only 63% of people survive up to age 1, 47% up to age 5, and in a little bit more recent years, increased to 74% to age 1 and 61% to age 5. And then in more recent, like in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, then you start to have even greater improvements. And then in more recent years, almost 100% of the people reaching age 5 in more advanced countries. And these are the percentage reaching age 25 and age 65. Age 65 was only 8% reaching that age back in the pre-modern times. And in Japan, for example, 93% of the people reach age 65. And this here would be the births required for zero population growth. So ZPG is zero population growth. Because mortality was so high in this pre-modern time, so life expectancy was so low that you had to have a really high fertility to replace the population in a way that you would pretty much just replace people that were dying in order to have zero population growth. So here, women would have to have at least 6.1 children in order to replace those dying so the population would not drop in size. But in more recent years, in more advanced countries, you see that total fertility rate equals to 2.1 per woman, means that then they would replace themselves and their partners. So we have talked about that before. The fertility at the replacement level of 2.1 means that women are replaced themselves and replace their partners, and it's 0.1 because you still see some high sex ratio at birth above 100, so you still see more boys being born than girls, so you need a little bit more than 2 to have at least one daughter being born for one woman. And also because of still you have mortality, so some women, some daughters, they don't reach the ages of 15 until 49 years when they are in childbearing years. So right now, because mortality is low, but you still have mortality and you still have more boys being born than girls, the fertility at the replacement level is 2.1, is not only 2, but it's much lower than what it was in the past. And life expectancy in the Roman area is estimated to have been only 22 years of age. People who reach adulthood were not too likely to reach a very advanced age, although of course some did reach more advanced age, but overall life expectancy at birth was really low. And in the Middle Ages, the plague, the Black Death, hit Europe in the 14th century, having spread west from Asia, and that an estimated 1/3 of the population of Europe may have perished from the disease between 1346 and 1350. So it appears to be the same disease that exists today, And we still don't know exactly why it was so fatal back then compared to more present times, but probably is due to general poor health and few resources to battle the disease back in the 1300s. And the Columbian exchange also had some effects on mortality rates. So Columbus and other European explorers took diseases, horses, and guns to the Americans. And they brought back new foods and few new diseases. But one explanation for the relative ease with which Spain dominated Latin America after arriving around 1500 is because explorers had immunity to the diseases they brought compared to the devastation the diseases affect indigenous populations. So a lot of the indigenous populations, they got the diseases from the explorers, and because they didn't have immunity from that, that's a major reason that made them die so quickly after the European explorers arrived in Latin America. And during the Industrial Revolution between 1760 and 1840, the plague and the Little Ice Age had receded. And around that same time, income improved, nutrition, so people were eating better because they had better income, their conditions of where they were living also improved, and sanitation also improved at that time. So life expectancy in Europe and the US was around 40 years of age, a huge improvement from previous centuries. But there is a major question. Was population growth a cause or effect of rising living standards? So maybe because we experience a high population growth, people start to work on other ways in order to improve their lives and generating more income and then bringing more nutrition, house, and sanitation. So population growth in that case caused better living standards, or maybe because people had better living standards, they tend to have more children, and that caused more population growth. So there is a reverse causality here in this case, which economists also call endogeneity. Population growth causes living standards, but living standards also cause population growth. But what's interesting to understand is that all this dynamic was going on at that time. So that's an unanswered question, but we always are trying to understand exactly what happened back during the Industrial Revolution time. So there were as many deaths to children under 5 years of age as there were at 65 and over. Infectious diseases were still the dominant reasons for death, but their ability to kill was diminishing. So mortality for children under age 5 was still high, but we were getting better in terms of fighting those diseases. And then in the 19th century, there were some key elements to postpone death that improved our mortality level. Improving mortality in this case here means lower mortality. So we started having a greater belief in the power of human intervention, so pretty much in Western science. We had an improved nutrition, which happened first in Western Europe. And at that time, we started to have more available clean water, implementation of toilets and bathing facilities, and also the implementation of sewage in cities. So some sanitation studies in Liverpool showed that the new sewage systems implemented in a series of cities, improved health and then made mortality drop in those countries. And the smallpox vaccinations, they also improved our resistance to in this case, to smallpox, and made us live longer as well. And a series of other improvements in medical knowledge and vaccinations and antiseptic procedures in surgery, and also even our knowledge about germs and diseases made us better understand how germs affected our lives. And so vaccinations and knowledge about germ theories and a series of antiseptic procedures, they helped us postpone death and live longer. And in the 20th century, health pretty much is seen as a social movement. It leading to government-organized universal healthcare systems in all rich countries except in the US. So health pretty much started being seen by modern societies as something that should be taken by the government as a service that should be provided to the whole population. So universal healthcare systems started to be implemented, and it is implemented in almost all rich countries in the world, except here in the United States. So, and antibiotics emerged around World War II. We start to see more vaccinations. The oral rehydration therapy for infants and adults also improved health for different age groups. Advanced diagnosis, advanced drugs, and other treatments for degenerative diseases kept older people alive longer as well. So we had a lot of improvements in life expectancy. Here we have life expectancy at birth among women for Mexico, US, and Canada. And for Mexico, we have data here starting in 1900, and for Canada, data started in 1920. So you see overall, whenever we have the data for the three countries, life expectancy at birth for women is higher in Canada, and then in the US, and with lowest levels in Mexico, but the differentials between these countries have been declining over time. So the differentials here between Mexico, US, and Canada is smaller than it was back in the 1920s, for example. But you see an improvement for all these countries over time. So the World War II was a turning point. After World War II, so right after World War II, 1950 and 1955, still you had low life expectancy, and again this one here for only for women in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, and North America. And then some decades later, after the end of World War II in 1945, you see a huge improvement in life expectancy at birth for women in all these different continents in the world, in all these different regions. So there are two ways to postpone death to the oldest possible ages. We can prevent diseases from occurring or spreading when they do happen. So we can do some prevention, and prevention can be done through vaccinations, clean water, sanitation, good health. So in this case here, no physicians are needed because it's all related more to public health, to good infrastructure in our societies. And the other way to postpone death is related to curing people of disease when they are sick. So we need better technology instead of like diagnostic technology, and more advanced drugs and more skilled physicians to deal with people that got sick. And in terms of nutrition, the nutrition transition and obesity, the poor people, they were skinny because only the rich could afford to access enough quantities of food. But this is not the case anymore. We see a nutrition transition in more recent years. And nutrition transition means that around the world, we had a change in terms of nutrition into a diet with high fat and processed foods. So now people have food that have high levels of fat and high levels of processed foods, diet low in fiber, less exercise, and increases in degenerative diseases. And so we see all those changes going on in more recent decades, in more recent contemporary societies. And as we mentioned before in this chapter, there are two important concepts here: lifespan and longevity. Lifespan is the oldest age to which human beings can survive. And as I mentioned before, there was this record of a French woman that she lived 122 years and 164 days, and this is data that we have the longest lifespan data from 2016. It is almost entirely a biological phenomenon. So lifespan is pretty much the maximum age that we have recorded of a human being reaching, and is really related to biological characteristics of the people. Longevity and life expectancy, which is the age at which people actually die, that's a measure that we mentioned before in the chapter that demographers are usually more concerned with. So that's the expected number of years to be lived on average by a particular population at a particular time. And it's currently about 71 years for all humans. So in this case here, it has both biological and social components, because it's not only related to our biology, but also to the societies where we live, to the health patterns, to social inequality, to economic opportunities, to gender inequalities that society has, and that societies have, that the societies experience. So populations with high mortality, they also tend to have high morbidity. So populations with high levels of mortality, they tend to have high levels of diseases. But this is not a one-on-one relationship. We may live longer even though not being very healthy. So a lot of people might live longer, but still have some sort of chronic disease, for example. But that's usually a general pattern that we see across the world. And mortality varies a lot by age. Humans are like most other animals with respect to the general pattern of death by age. The very young and the old are the most vulnerable. Very young, those like children below age 5, and young adults are the least likely to die. So the risks of death are relatively low after the initial year of life. After the baby reaches 1 year of age, the chances of dying drop a lot, and it's lasting at least until middle age. And then after middle age, around the 50s and 60s, then you start seeing older people starting to have higher chances of dying. And actually, the ages in which we have lower risks of death correspond to exactly the ages where people usually reproduce more, where people have children. So beyond the middle age, beyond the 50s and 60 years of age, mortality starts to increase, although at a decelerating rate. So just an example of mortality by age, we have in this graph here with deaths per 1,000 people for each one of these age groups for Japan, Guatemala, and Nigeria, and data from 2011. And so we see that the very young people, they have higher chances of dying per 1,000 people in this case, and the old people have a higher chances of dying. So you see that after the first year of age, when people reach age 1, then the chances of dying decline a lot, declining even more when they reach 15 and 20 years of age. And then as people start to get old, they start to have higher mortality rates. But the rate starts to increase more exactly after middle ages, around 50, 60 years of age. That's when you start to see an increase in the death rates again. But you see that for example, here for Nigeria, the high levels of infant mortality here is reached again only when people reach 75 years of age. In Japan, when people are around 50 years of age. And mortality also varies by sex. So when we're talking about sex, the variable related to just usually sex among them for demographers is captured with self-identification. So the person self-classified as being man or woman. Women have a lower probability of death at every age from the moment of conception. So that's a biological nature of women. They live in longer than men in all ages that we can measure from 0 years of age until 100 plus. But unless society intervenes with a lower status for women that gives them less food, less access to healthcare, less education, and lower earnings, women will live longer. But if some societies have some disparities by gender of women having lower status, of parents giving less food to daughters than to sons, of daughters having less access to healthcare, less education, lower earnings, then in those societies, when you see more gender inequities, then you might see higher mortality rates for women. But that's because of the societies that don't treat women and men in the same way. And there are several other mortality differentials by place where people live, either if they're living in urban or rural areas. Usually people living in urban areas have better life standards than those living in rural areas. Also we also see neighborhood inequalities in terms of mortality. People in the slums have worse health than people living in other areas in the city. People with better education live longer. People with higher social status, or so rich people, live longer. And also we see some differentials by race, ethnicity. And for example, in the US, on average, African Americans, they have lower life expectancy than non-Hispanic whites, for example. And also by marital status. Being married is also, married people, they have higher health, have better health and higher life expectancy than people in other marital status. So that's the portion that I had to talk at this subtopic in the lecture about mortality. Thank you very much.